Hi everybody! This video is basically done by request. A long-time Dave Smith Instruments user, known as Sacred Synthesis, asked me how well the Pro 2 is performing when it's emulating analog sounds, after he watched my most recent Pro 2 demos. Now, the first video I did featured actually 3 analog-like sounds, 2 monophonic ones and 1 paired. But it was maybe due to the nature of the monophonic sounds having been built from 4 oscillators each that they may have sounded a bit less convincing, or too big for that matter. So I've tried to keep things a bit simpler this time, which is really like a lesson in aestheticism on this particular synth. But since most classic analog monosynths usually offer not more than 2 oscillators, with the exception of models like the Minimoog, I stripped it down here and there. Please bear in mind though, that it's always difficult to put oneself into someone else's shoes. I'm going to try to approximate what Sacred Synthesis may have had in mind, but that also means that I'm going to be prone to fail. Before I continue though, I should say thank you to Sacred Synthesis and remind you of checking out his YouTube channel. He's programming and using a lot of wonderfully lush ambient-like sounds that are based on his poly evolvers and Prophet 8s. I also included a link to his site in the description below, so make sure to take a listen. Okay, so after I took another look at the subtitle of this video, I realized that it may be a little tricky, as the analog side of the Pro 2 is, strictly speaking, at least in technical terms, its signal path after the oscillator and the character sections. It includes the filter section, the VCA, and the analog stereo distortion. So what we have here is a hybrid synth with a purely digital front end that is comprised of the oscillator section. This video is not about the Pro 2's single building blocks though, whether they are analog or digital, but about the Pro 2's capability to create sounds that emulate an analog character. If you're looking for a thorough explanation of the Pro 2's architecture, I can only recommend you to watch Mark Doty's comprehensive overview of the Pro 2, which you'll be able to find on his YouTube channel, Automatic Gainsay. You'll find the corresponding link in the description as well. Now, before I start with my examples, I should point out that, at least in my view, the projected dichotomy between analog and digital does not encompass a mindset with which I would recommend to approach the Pro 2, since it would end up in being a far too limiting attempt. The synth strength lies in the combination of the best of both worlds, as Dave Smith himself said in the According Manual. And it's the juxtaposition of both analog and digital elements it draws its sonic flexibility from. Nevertheless, I'm going to remain a purist with regard to at least one aspect. I won't add any additional effects, in the sense of outboard gear, to the sound of the Pro 2. But in order to spice things up with some spatial flavor here and there, I'll make use of the Pro 2's delays. At first, I will always play the sound completely dry though. The first sound is built of 4 oscillators, but only 3 of them actually represent a classic analog synth waveform, the sawtooth. The 4th one is a noise source that adds a little bit of subtle, noise. The LFOs are quite simple. The first one controls the oscillator shapes, similar to pulse width modulation. The second LFO is modulating all the oscillator's frequencies, controlled by aftertouch. And the third LFO controls the filter to cutoff frequency. The second sound consists of two oscillators, two sawtooth oscillators, slightly detuned to each other. The first LFO is controlling only the frequency of oscillator 1, and the second LFO controls all the oscillators' frequency, controlled by aftertouch. And LFO 3, again, filter to cutoff frequency. Now the third sound is a variation of the second one. It's also built of two sawtooth oscillators. The LFO settings are quite simple again. LFO 1 controls oscillator 1's frequency, or LFO 2 all the oscillator's frequencies, and LFO 3 the filter to cutoff again to add some movement. The fourth sound contains only one oscillator, a pulse wave, and the pulse width is modulated by one of the auxiliary envelopes. Here you can see the shape, And the LFO settings are quite simple. It's just that the oscillator one frequency is being modulated, and that modulation is controlled by aftertouch again. I also added some drive and distortion to this sound. The drive setting is 12, the distortion setting is 24. That's not just subtle, but because I'm using only one oscillator, it doesn't really overdrive the sound so much or distort it, but adds harmonics. So this is a good example for those parameters being good timbre enhancement tools instead of just tools that will, I don't know, destroy your sound or completely distort it. Now, this kind of sound, that is when you control the pulse width modulation with an envelope, that always reminds me of the fuzz guitar preset of the ARP Pro Solist. When I'm playing this example, you may know what I mean. Now, the fifth sound is a paraphonic sound that has already been featured in my last video series. It contains 4 sawtooth oscillators that each have their own slop settings and that are slightly detuned towards each other. The first LFO is modulating the filter frequency of filter 2, who is set to bandpass here. And the LFO frequency itself is controlled by an auxiliary envelope. So you get this temporally modulated filter sweep. And I mean, listen to this. This is not really how you would expect a hybrid monophonic synth to sound like, is it? Sounds a little bit like a vintage Yamaha CS synth that needs a little bit of maintenance. Now the sixth example might be a bit of a silly one, but I thought about, why only trying to emulate vintage analog sounds? How about vintage analog synth doing sound effects? And one of those classic sound effects is storm and thunder and rain. So this sound is built out of 3 oscillators that have an individual noise setting, all 3 types of noise, violet, white and red. And the first LFO is controlling the filter 1 frequency with a random shape to emulate the thunder. LFO 2 controls filter 2 cutoff frequency for the storm movement, and LFO 3 controls the LFO 2 frequency to add a little bit of randomness to the storm movement. And the ratio between rain and storm is controlled by the second touch slider, and the thunder coming in is controlled by the first touch slider. Now, I couldn't resist doing a bit more complex sound in the end that consists of 4 waves, 4 pulse waves, that each have their individual slop, glide, and tuning settings, and even volume settings. The LFO 1 controls the frequency of oscillator 4, and LFO 2 controls the delay time to give it a little bit of a vintage wobble. Now the sequencer settings are as follows. Track 2 controls the frequency of oscillator 1, track 3 the frequency of oscillator 2, track 4 the frequency of oscillator 3, and track 5 the frequency of oscillator 4. Track 6 controls the filter 2 resonance, track 7 the envelope amount of filter 1, and track 8 controls the distortion, which comes in and out to add a little bit of movement. So there is nothing really that that is particularly digital about this sound. That's it, folks. Thanks for watching, and see you later.